In 1898, the Whitmore estate in Charleston, South Carolina, stood as a symbol of wealth, tradition, and rigid social hierarchy. Its sprawling halls, gilded chandeliers, and polished floors reflected generations of prosperity, yet behind the opulence lay tensions that few outsiders could perceive. That spring, the family prepared a banquet intended to display not only their affluence but their lineage, cementing their legacy among Charleston's elite. Servants worked in hushed urgency, polishing silverware, laying elaborate place settings, and arranging the finest cuts of meat and exotic ingredients imported from distant markets. Guests arrived in finery, exchanging pleasantries over the hum of candlelit conversation, unaware that the evening would unravel into a nightmarish tableau of illness, fear, and speculation. As the meal commenced, subtle irregularities went largely unnoticed. A faint bitterness in the sauces, a lingering metallic scent in the air, and shadows that seemed to flicker independently of candlelight. Within hours, several family members fell gravely ill, their symptoms baffling local physicians. Some succumbed swiftly, while others lingered, their suffering inexplicably synchronized and inconsistent with known ailments. Witnesses later reported chilling phenomena, soft whispers in empty rooms, glimpses of figures in corridors that should have been vacant, and an oppressive silence that seemed to consume the estate itself. The combination of aristocratic formality and sudden catastrophe created a psychological dissonance that would haunt the region for decades. Medical accounts in contemporary newspapers offered little clarity. Doctors documented unusual fevers, convulsions, and respiratory distress but could not determine a single cause. Rumors spread quickly. Some suggested deliberate poisoning. Others speculated on the presence of rare herbs or tainted ingredients, while clergy whispered of ancestral curses invoked by broken rituals or familial sin. Psychologists of later eras would interpret the event as a convergence of stress, fear, and inherited trauma, amplified by the weight of social expectation and secrecy. Meanwhile, local lore painted the banquet as a moral parable, a cautionary tale of pride, indulgence, and the invisible consequences of past transgressions. By juxtaposing elegance and horror, reason and superstition, this introduction sets the tone for a story suspended between fact and myth. The audience is drawn into a world where the ordinary, the careful hosting of a family dinner, collides with the inexplicable, leaving room for psychological, cultural, and supernatural interpretations. The Whitmore banquet becomes more than an event. It is a prism through which themes of power, guilt, and human vulnerability are refracted. Perhaps the tragedy arose from human error, perhaps from vengeance beyond comprehension, or perhaps from forces that defy rational explanation. The stage is set for a narrative that is as haunting as it is unresolved, ensuring the story lingers in memory long after the candles have burned out. The Whitmore Manor, perched on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina, was more than a residence. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and an unyielding social order. Constructed in the 1840s by the Whitmore patriarch, Jonathan Whitmore, the estate boasted sweeping verandas, towering columns, and a meticulously maintained rose garden that stretched to the edge of the riverbank. Its architecture reflected old-world grandeur, high ceilings adorned with gilded plaster, expansive windows that framed the sultry southern sky, and oak-paneled walls engraved with family crests that chronicled generations of influence. Visitors often remarked on the manor's beauty and refinement, unaware that beneath its elegance lay an intricate web of tension, secrecy, and latent malice. The Whitmores maintained appearances with precision, their public interactions polished, polite, and ceremonious, masking fractures that would eventually ripple through the family with devastating effect. Daily life at Whitmore Manor followed a strict hierarchy. Servants, maids, butlers, and cooks moved like shadows along polished floors, their presence constant but unobtrusive. They were bound by unspoken rules, never to contradict a family member, never to reveal what they observed, and never to step outside the invisible boundaries of propriety. Diaries recovered decades later reveal a subtle unease. The staff noted minor but troubling occurrences, including missing silverware, whispered arguments in drawing rooms, and the occasional unexplained chill in rooms that should have been warm. One maid wrote in 1897, "I hear words in the hall that do not belong to any conversation. Faces appear at windows when no one is near." These seemingly trivial observations, when woven together, suggest that the manor itself fostered an atmosphere of constant vigilance, fear, and suppressed anxiety, a breeding ground for suspicion, gossip, and dread. The family hierarchy mirrored the physical structure of the manor. The patriarch, Edward Whitmore, exerted control with an almost ritualistic insistence on etiquette, protocol, and order. His children, though educated and cultivated, lived under the unrelenting weight of expectation, each action scrutinized for adherence to family norms. Diaries and letters reveal rivalries beneath the surface, jealousy over inheritance, disputes over marriages, and resentment toward perceived favoritism. Servants recorded hushed quarrels that never reached public knowledge. Disputes over portraits hung in the Great Hall, disagreements about seating at formal dinners, and tensions surrounding them, management of estates in Charleston and beyond. These internal conflicts created a psychological backdrop in which even minor slights could become explosive, where the careful performance of civility masked deep-seated malice. The manor's design amplified this tension. Long corridors echoed, footsteps unnaturally, mirrors reflected glimpses of movement that may have been, or may not have been, real. And the kitchens were labyrinthine, filled with scents of roasting meats, spices, and occasionally faintly sour odors that servants could not identify. Family gatherings, particularly dinners, became stages for performance. Polite conversation, the subtle negotiation of alliances, and the tacit signaling of power through gestures, placement at the table, and choice of words. Psychological contrasts dominate. Civility versus cruelty, loyalty versus betrayal, innocence versus malevolence. Researchers studying historical records suggest that environments emphasizing hierarchy, observation, and secrecy often amplify latent human tendencies toward paranoia, suspicion, and aggression. The Whitmore Manor, scholars argue, exemplified this dynamic in its most concentrated form. Observers outside the family also noted irregularities. Neighbors and local merchants described the Whitmores as outwardly gracious, yet distant, almost impervious to the realities beyond their estate walls. Rumors circulated, strange lights flickering in upper windows at night, carriage horses acting skittishly for no apparent reason, and unexplainable sounds emanating from the dining hall during hours when no dinner was served. Children in nearby homes spoke of shadows moving in the gardens, of doors that creaked open by themselves, and of fleeting figures glimpsed behind curtains. These anecdotal accounts, while unverifiable, contributed to a growing aura of fear and fascination surrounding the estate. The manor was no longer merely a house. It had become a locus of psychological tension, a character in its own right capable of influencing perception, behavior, and the unfolding of events. Historians analyzing correspondence, ledgers, and diaries emphasize the interplay between observation and interpretation. Servants' notes reveal careful attention to patterns of behavior, while family letters suggest subtle signaling, coercion, and manipulation. In one 1896 letter, a daughter recounts, "Father expects perfection, and though we comply, I fear my every misstep is noted in ways I cannot see." These fragments demonstrate that life at Whitmore Manor was lived under constant scrutiny, where fear and anticipation became habitual, and where the distinction between reality and perception blurred. This psychological environment, rigid, hierarchy, concealed hostility, and pervasive observation, set the stage for the fateful banquet of 1898, a seemingly ordinary event poised to descend into tragedy. The dining hall, in particular, emerges as a focal point. Its long oak table could seat 30 guests, each chair carefully positioned to signal rank, favor, and authority. Candles flickered along the length of the table, casting moving shadows that interacted with the intricate plasterwork overhead. The placement of food, utensils, and even napkins reflected centuries of family tradition. It was within this meticulously constructed space of etiquette and control that unseen tensions would converge. The hall's atmosphere was charged, not merely with expectation, but with the latent energy of rivalry, jealousy, and fear. Scholars argue that physical environments that reinforce hierarchy and ritual magnify psychological stress, creating a fertile setting for accidents, conflict, or perhaps the inexplicable. Even the exterior of the manor contributed to its mythic aura. The gardens were labyrinthine, punctuated by statues of ancestors whose stone eyes seemed to watch visitors. Hedges were sculpted into geometric patterns, yet behind them lay hidden pathways, decaying sheds, and the occasional glimpse of objects misplaced or left as though by intention. Seasonal storms would rattle windows, causing doors to slam and shutters to creak, adding an auditory element to the estate's unsettling character. The interplay of light and shadow, inside and outside, created an environment where the boundaries between observation, imagination, and reality were persistently tested. In summary, the Whitmore Manor was both setting and character. Its architectural grandeur, combined with rigid social hierarchy and the psychological pressures of family life, established a world in which fear, secrecy, and latent malice thrived. Every corridor, dining hall, and shadowed corner played a role in sustaining tension, ensuring that even routine activities were imbued with potential danger. Historical reconstruction of daily life, social etiquette, and interpersonal dynamics reveals how subtle behaviors, environmental cues, and internal rivalries set the stage for catastrophe. The manor itself became anagent in the unfolding story, amplifying the emotional resonance of observation, rumor, and memory. As the audience is drawn into the Whitmore estate, it becomes clear that tragedy was not merely the result of a single event, but the product of an environment in which civility and cruelty, loyalty and betrayal, coexist in a delicate and ultimately perilous balance. The night of the Whitmore banquet began under the glimmering chandeliers of the grand dining hall, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of rare spices. Guests arrived in elaborate gowns and tailored suits, smiles carefully painted over social tension. The Whitmore family, masters of appearances, orchestrated the evening Asboth spectacle and demonstration of lineage, opulence, and influence. Yet beneath the polished veneer of hospitality lay simmering resentment, latent rivalries, and unspoken secrets. Diaries and letters from attendees preserved in fragments speak of fleeting anxieties, an uncle avoiding eye contact, a cousin whispering behind a fan, a servant pausing abruptly as though noticing something invisible. These subtle disturbances, imperceptible to the casual observer, set the psychological stage for what would become a night of horror. The meal commenced with an air of ceremony. Servers moved silently, presenting dishes of exotic meats, delicate pastries, and intricately spiced sauces. Fine wine flowed freely from decanters embossed with the family crest, and the clink of glasses punctuated polite conversation. Yet even as the banquet followed expected patterns, anomalies emerged. Guests later recalled brief shadows flitting across walls, despite the absence of movement or wind. A faint metallic tang seemed to hang in the hall, detected by some but denied by others. A hush occasionally descended for inexplicable moments, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. These small but pervasive disturbances, once dismissed as nerves or coincidence, now appear as ominous harbingers of the catastrophe to come. The toast itself, a gesture meant to unify family and fortune, became the pivot point of disaster. Edward Whitmore, the patriarch, lifted a crystal glass brimming with deep red wine, intending to honor ancestors and celebrate continuity. The glasses touched lightly and the first sips were taken. Almost immediately, subtle reactions occurred. Some guests complained of a bitter taste, others of a metallic aftertaste. Within minutes, pallor replaced color. Smiles turned to grimaces and murmurs of discomfort spread like wildfire. By the time the main courses were served, nausea had set in for many, accompanied by cramps, tremors, and fainting. The pace of onset was startlingly synchronized, transcending what any known disease or poisoning could plausibly induce. Eyewitnesses later described the hall descending into an unnatural quiet, punctuated by gasps and coughs, as both family and staff grappled with an unfolding and inexplicable medical emergency. Panic mingled with the familiar routines of etiquette. Some attempted to assist those faltering, while others adhered rigidly to social decorum, masking fear with forced civility. Servants carried trays and glassware, occasionally bumping into disoriented guests. The duality of human behavior, politeness under duress versus instinctive fear, illuminates one of the evening's most haunting contrasts. Amid convulsions and pallor, some guests noted the eerie synchronicity of symptoms. Those seated near the patriarch or at certain positions around the table appeared more severely affected. Scholars and modern investigators speculate that proximity to family authority, long intertwined with stress and inherited guilt, may have played a role in amplifying psychosomatic responses. Ritual, hierarchy, and expectation combined with physiological reactions in ways that challenge both historical and contemporary analysis. As chaos escalated, attempts at intervention were inconsistent and haphazard. Medical practitioners, summoned from the city, arrived to find confusion compounded by a lack of documentation and fragmented recollections. Efforts to stabilize victims with laudanum, herbs, or cold compresses yielded mixed results. Some guests appeared to recover briefly, only to collapse again within minutes. The interplay of physical symptoms, environmental factors, and psychological stress created a feedback loop in which observation itself seemed to exacerbate perception of illness. The banquet, once an emblem of celebration, transformed into a living tableau of suffering, uncertainty, and fear. Theories proliferated almost immediately. Local newspapers offered sensationalized accounts, citing accidental poisoning, spoiled ingredients, and even divine retribution. Letters preserved in the Whitmore archives hint at more calculated interpretations, jealousy, vendettas, and long-simmering grievances encoded in menu selection or seating arrangements. Historians examining the event note that the meticulous attention to detail, herbs measured to precise fractions, dishes prepared hours in advance, wine carefully decanted, creates ambiguity. Were these ordinary acts of hospitality gone wrong, or deliberate manipulations with catastrophic consequences? The simultaneous onset of symptoms resists explanation solely by accident, yet no evidence of foul play was conclusively documented. In this gap between fact and speculation, superstition flourished. The sensory and psychological elements of the banquet further complicate analysis. Guests reported flickering shadows, inexplicable cold spots, and a faint odor of bitter almonds lingering near untouched plates. Mirrors reflected shapes that did not correspond to human movement, and subtle whispers seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Psychologists studying the incident suggest mass psychogenic illness as a contributing factor. In small, socially cohesive groups, anxiety and expectation can amplify physical sensations, turning minor discomfort into severe symptomatology. Yet the severity and uniformity of reactions surpass most known examples, leaving the possibility of contamination, ritualistic action, or extraordinary coincidence tantalizingly open. Eyewitness diaries and letters reveal human reactions in sharp contrast. Some guests offered calm support, prioritizing care for others despite personal distress. Others succumbed to fear, retreating into corners or attempting flight. The duality, selflessness versus panic, mirrors the broader contrast between ceremony and chaos. Every action and observation was filtered through social expectations, inherited authority, and moral psychology, making it difficult to disentangle fact from perception. The banquet became not only a medical and social disaster, but also a psychological crucible, shaping memory, rumor, and legend for generations. In the aftermath, investigations struggled to pinpoint cause. Food remnants were tested using the limited techniques of the era, revealing nothing conclusive. The wine was scrutinized, yet results were inconclusive. Possible contamination, minor spoilage, or deliberate tampering could not be definitively demonstrated. Priests and spiritualists invoked curses, ancestral retribution, and moral lessons, contrasting sharply with scientific inquiry and rational skepticism. Community memory absorbed the event as both cautionary tale and moral allegory, preserving the banquet's horror while amplifying uncertainty. Over decades, the night became a nexus where human error, psychological stress, and superstition coalesced, leaving the Whitmore Manor both haunted and haunted by questions. The fatal banquet illustrates extremes of contrast: celebration versus catastrophe, innocence versus inherited malevolence, ritual versus chaos. The sensory experience, the smell of spices, the clink of glasses, the flicker of candlelight, intertwines with perception, expectation, and fear, to create a narrative that is as psychological as it is historical. Letters, diaries, and fragmented newspaper clippings allow modern viewers to reconstruct the evening with cinematic tension, highlighting human vulnerability, moral complexity, and the unpredictability of events where both natural and supernatural explanations persist in uneasy coexistence. In the end, the banquet resists closure. Whether tragedy arose from human action, accident, or something beyond comprehension remains unresolved, leaving an indelible mark on the Whitmore family legacy and the cultural memory of Charleston. The aftermath of the Whitmore banquet left Charleston both traumatized and mystified. Investigators descended upon the manor in the days that followed, bringing their instruments, chemical reagents, and meticulous notebooks. Physicians examined the survivors and the deceased, recording symptoms that defied conventional medical understanding: intense nausea, convulsions, paleness, and sporadic heart irregularities. While some manifestations resembled known poisonings, the uniformity and timing of the reaction suggested a phenomenon beyond ordinary explanation. Experts attempted to trace the origin of the distress to the meal itself, meticulously cataloging ingredients, preparation methods, and utensils. Yet the evidence remained fragmented, elusive, and contradictory. Modern historians observing these records highlight the interplay between empirical investigation and the interpretive framework imposed by fear, hierarchy, and expectation. Chemical analysis of remnants recovered from the banquet table hinted at the presence of rare herbs, potentially toxic substances, and unusual combinations of spices not typically found in local kitchens. Some compounds were exotic, imported from distant colonies, suggesting both wealth and meticulous planning. Yet even with these findings, investigators could not reproduce the symptoms reliably. Laboratory replication attempts were inconclusive. Concentrations detected were insufficient to explain the severity or simultaneity of reactions. This scientific impasse fostered tension between reason and speculation, prompting authorities, families, and townspeople to seek alternative explanations. Here, the contrast between observable evidence and interpretive narrative begins to dominate, forming a psychological and cultural framework that persists to this day. Amid the uncertainty, spiritual interpretations emerged almost immediately. Local clergy, steeped in the Catholic tradition of Charleston's elite, whispered of ancestral curses and divine retribution. Some claimed that the Whitmore bloodline carried guilt from previous transgressions, land disputes, mistreatment of servants, and acts of concealment now returning to punish the present generation. Folklorists note that oral traditions quickly wove these narratives into cautionary tales. Children were warned against arrogance and gluttony. Guests retold the story as a moral lesson about pride, and the estate itself became a symbol of unseen justice. These interpretations coexist with empirical inquiry, illustrating the tension between rational investigation and human desire for moral narrative. Psychologists examining archival accounts suggest that the pattern of illness could be partially explained through psychosomatic responses, amplified by social observation and intergenerational stress. Survivors and witnesses were not passive observers. They were active participants, interpreting and responding to the symptoms of those around them. This phenomenon, known as mass psychogenic illness, has been documented in other historical events where fear and expectation intensify physiological responses. Within the context of the Whitmore Manor, inherited guilt, familial pressure, and the psychological weight of social status may have contributed to the amplification of perceived illness. Each individual's fear became both a cause and effect, creating a feedback loop that defied simple measurement or control. The investigation further revealed anomalies in everyday objects. Knives, serving platters, and kitchen tools bore unexplained markings. Personal letters hinted at secret instructions, cryptic warnings, and the meticulous selection of menu ingredients. Scholars debating these findings posit that the intertwining of human intention and superstition produced a scenario that was partially orchestrated and partially emergent from circumstance. Could a single deliberate act have precipitated the cascade of illness? Or did cultural expectation, psychological suggestion, and ancestral myth combine to generate the tragedy? The ambiguity here is critical, highlighting the inherent difficulty of separating fact from interpretation in historical inquiry. Surviving manuscripts, including preparatory menus and handwritten notes, indicate both precision and ritualized behavior. Certain dishes followed precise timing sequences, measured to the minute, while ceremonial placement of silverware and decanters suggested attention to symbolic detail. This ritualized precision lends weight to theories of intentionality, but remains inconclusive. Analysts debate whether these measures reflect ordinary aristocratic obsession with presentation or deliberate preparation for harm. In either case, they reveal the potent interaction of environment, human behavior, and psychological framing. Shadows in the manor, whispered warnings, and the echoing architecture of the dining hall further amplified these effects, creating a setting where perception itself became part of the causal chain. Religious and cultural frameworks offered explanatory power in ways that science could not. Ancestors' moral transgressions were framed as karmic debt, a concept easily integrated into the Gothic sensibility of Charleston's elite. Priests recorded confessions of fear, not only regarding physical illness but spiritual contamination. Guests who survived the banquet described fleeting apparitions, whispered voices, and objects shifting inexplicably. Folklorists argue that these accounts, while perhaps exaggerated or misremembered, served a societal function, transforming a traumatic event into a narrative with lessons, boundaries, and moral clarity. Even as scientists sought reproducible evidence, the story persisted in the moral imagination, blending fear and fascination into cultural memory. The tension between science and superstition persisted over decades. Subsequent chemical analyses, conducted as laboratory technology advanced, provided partial support for toxicological theories. Traces of alkaloids, fungal toxins, and rare herbs were confirmed, yet none accounted for the precise timing, geographic distribution within the manor, or variation in severity among guests. Simultaneously, oral histories reinforced supernatural interpretations, describing spectral figures, murmurs of ancestral voices, and recurring dreams among descendants. The convergence of rational inquiry and folklore illustrates a central human desire to impose order and meaning on chaos, whether through scientific reasoning or moral narrative. Psychologically, the banquet provides a case study in complex causality. The event demonstrates how environment, social hierarchy, inherited guilt, and cultural expectation interact to produce outcomes that are simultaneously tangible and intangible. Symptoms may have been influenced by toxicity, stress, and observation. Fear magnified perception, and ritual reinforced expectation. Supernatural interpretations, while empirically unprovable, reflect cognitive frameworks that prioritize narrative coherence and moral structure. The Whitmore tragedy thereby exists at the intersection of multiple explanatory domains: medicine, psychology, folklore, and ethics. Ultimately, the Whitmore banquet remains unresolved. Science offers tantalizing hints but no definitive answers. Superstition and folklore provide meaning but evade empirical verification. The interplay of human intention, inherited trauma, and environmental cues resists reduction to simple cause and effect logic. Scholars continue to debate: was the tragedy orchestrated by deliberate human action, magnified by psychological contagion, or influenced by forces beyond comprehension? Every investigation, every manuscript, and every oral account reinforces the ambiguity, ensuring that the narrative retains its tension between rationality and myth. In exploring the banquet through science and superstition, the story of the Whitmore Manor illustrates the human struggle to understand catastrophe. It demonstrates how observation, memory, and interpretation shape historical perception, and how moral and psychological frameworks overlay empirical evidence. Shadows, whispered warnings, and chemical traces converge in a tableau that is both measurable and mysterious, inviting modern viewers to question the boundaries between fact and belief. The Whitmore tragedy persists not because of certainty, but because of enduring ambiguity, where science and superstition collide in a lasting, haunting tension that continues to captivate scholars, descendants, and the public imagination. The night of the Whitmore banquet left a mark that transcended physical evidence, embedding itself deeply in memory, narrative, and imagination. Survivors of the tragedy, whether they were family members, servants, or local witnesses, carried fragments of that evening in their minds, fragments that would resurface across decades in diaries, letters, and oral recollections. Each account reflected both personal experience and collective anxiety, revealing the malleable interplay between observation, fear, and cultural expectation. Some survivors recalled the lingering aroma of exotic spices, faintly bitter and impossible to categorize, that seemed to pervade the mansion long after the plates were cleared. Others described fleeting shadows in the hallways, figures that vanished when approached, or the sensation of invisible hands brushing against the skin. These descriptions, though varied in detail, share a common psychological thread: the human impulse to interpret inexplicable events through memory, imagination, and inherited narrative. Descendants of the Whitmore family often recounted dreams and visions that tied back to the banquet, suggesting the persistence of trauma across generations. A grandchild of one of the victims reported recurring nightmares in which the dining hall stretched endlessly, filled with candles that flickered without wind, and with faces contorted in silent anguish. Another descendant described waking to the scent of herbs and roasting meat in an empty room, the experience accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. Such accounts illustrate the phenomenon of intergenerational memory, in which the psychological weight of trauma is transmitted through storytelling, emotional imprint, and familial culture. Scholars argue that these narratives operate as both warning and remembrance, shaping moral and ethical frameworks while simultaneously preserving the event in the cultural consciousness. Servants who survived the banquet provided another layer of testimony, often characterized by a blend of fear, reverence, and guilt. Many were reluctant to speak openly, constrained by loyalty, class, or fear of retribution. Yet fragments of memoirs and oral interviews suggest that they observed anomalies the family preferred to dismiss. Some claim to have heard whispered conversations in empty corridors, faint footsteps in locked kitchens, or the rustle of cloth when no one was present. Others documented unusual physical phenomena, glasses tipping without contact, candle flames that bent as if blown by invisible breath, and temperature drops localized to specific corners of the dining hall. These observations, whether grounded in the supernatural, misperception, or a heightened psychological state induced by stress, provide crucial insight into how ordinary individuals interpret uncertainty and threat. Local townspeople also contributed to the collective memory, transforming the event into a regional legend that blended fact with folklore. Market traders, clergy, and neighbors who witnessed fragments of the aftermath shared stories that often conflicted in detail but converged in tone. One merchant recalled seeing family members convulsing in the grand hall, while another remembered the eerie stillness of the house immediately afterward, as if the estate itself were holding its breath. Children were warned to avoid the Whitmore grounds, with tales of ghosts and curses woven into admonishments about obedience and morality. The interplay between lived experience and communal storytelling demonstrates how memory is socially constructed, shaped not only by observation, but by the expectations and anxieties of the broader community. The tension between documented evidence and memory is a recurring theme in these accounts. Diaries and letters, preserved by survivors, sometimes contradict police reports, medical records, and newspaper articles, highlighting the selective nature of recollection. In one journal, a family member described seeing the chandeliers sway violently, even though official records note no drafts or structural instability. A servant's memoir claims to have witnessed faint silhouettes flitting across the kitchen walls, yet inspection reports from the time attribute these anomalies to shadows cast by flickering gas lamps. These divergences illustrate a fundamental contrast: perception versus reality, imagination versus observation, and belief versus skepticism. Memory does not merely record events. It interprets, amplifies, and reconstructs them, often in alignment with emotional and psychological states. Psychologists analyzing these accounts emphasize the role of trauma in shaping memory. The sudden, violent onset of illness and death creates intense stress, activating the amygdala and influencing how events are encoded and recalled. Fear, guilt, and social pressure can enhance the vividness of certain details while diminishing or altering others, leading to a patchwork of memory that is both authentic and distorted. Survivors frequently interpreted ambiguous stimuli, creaking floors, drafts, shadows as evidence of malevolent forces, a process reinforced by communal narratives and family stories. In this context, memory functions as both a record and a distortion, preserving essential truths while also embellishing, recontextualizing, or mythologizing them. The decaying state of the Whitmore Manor further amplified the persistence of haunting narratives. As rooms fell into disrepair, hallways became shadowed and uneven, and once grand kitchens grew cold and overrun with vermin. Observers interpreted these environmental changes as confirmation of lingering malevolence. Windows that rattled in the wind, doors that groaned without cause, and furniture that shifted with age became woven into stories of spectral presence. Descendants and locals alike reported feelings of oppression, dread, or unease upon entering the abandoned estate, experiences that reinforced the notion of Themenor as a locus of enduring trauma. The physical decay mirrored the social and psychological unraveling initiated by the banquet, intertwining space, memory, and fear. Oral histories reveal additional layers of cultural interpretation. Community storytellers framed the banquet as a cautionary tale about pride, greed, and moral recklessness, connecting individual experiences to broader ethical narratives. Children were warned not only about the estate, but about behaviors that might invite misfortune or divine punishment. Servants and family members occasionally included moral commentary in their recollections, suggesting that the event was both a tragedy and a lesson. Folklorists highlight that such framing serves a dual purpose. It preserves memory while encoding social norms, ensuring that the story persists as both historical record and moral instruction. These narratives also reflect the interplay of individual psychology and collective consciousness. Some survivors attributed anomalies to supernatural forces, while others emphasized human error or coincidence. Discrepancies between accounts often reveal the influence of social dynamics. Family members may minimize certain details to protect reputation, while servants emphasize observations that underscore loyalty or diligence. Across generations, memory becomes a negotiation between personal experience and communal interpretation, producing a layered, contested narrative that resists simple resolution. Each retelling contributes to the mythos of the Whitmore banquet, reinforcing its status as a story that is simultaneously historical, psychological, and supernatural. The persistence of these memories underscores the role of imagination in sustaining cultural legacy. Even when factual verification is impossible, the emotional truth of the events remains compelling. Stories of shadows, scents, whispers, and inexplicable movement are repeated, elaborated, and transmitted, forming a network of recollection that bridges time. Survivors' accounts illuminate not only what occurred on the night of the banquet, but also how human beings make sense of catastrophe, constructing meaning from chaos and embedding lessons, fears, and moral frameworks into memory. The Whitmore tragedy demonstrates that memory is neither passive nor uniform. It is active, interpretive, and enduring. In analyzing the banquet through survivors' accounts, the story reveals a tension between evidence and perception, history and legend, rationality and belief. Shadows in corridors, lingering scents, and dreams of the event become as significant as chemical analyses or eyewitness reports, illustrating how trauma and imagination interact to create haunting narratives. Memory preserves uncertainty while providing a framework for understanding, transforming catastrophe into legend and tragedy into cultural touchstone. The Whitmore Manor is remembered not solely for the events themselves, but for the reverberations they generated in the consciousness of those who lived, witnessed, and inherited their legacy. Ultimately, survivors' accounts and memory illustrate that the banquet's horror extended far beyond physical illness or death. It persisted in consciousness, shaping identity, morality, and cultural imagination. The decay of the manor, the dispersion of the family, and the communal retelling of events ensured that the tragedy remained alive, contested, and transformative. By exploring memory as both record and distortion, the narrative captures the enduring psychological and cultural resonance of a single catastrophic event, inviting viewers to question the boundaries between perception and reality, observation and imagination in history and myth. The Whitmore banquet, preserved through memory, becomes an enduring mirror of human vulnerability, moral complexity, and the haunting persistence of uncertainty. The Whitmore banquet continued to haunt Charleston long after the last plate had been cleared, and the manor fell into disrepair. Historians, psychologists, folklorists, and even amateur sleuths have returned again and again to the accounts of that night, seeking answers that remain maddeningly elusive. Each layer of inquiry brings with it more questions than certainties. Scholars debate whether the events were the result of deliberate murder, carelessness, ancestral vengeance, or some convergence of forces beyond human understanding. Letters preserved in private collections, once considered mundane family correspondence, reveal curious inconsistencies, a recipe repeated with subtle differences, references to rare herbs that may have been poisonous, and notes hinting at ceremonial acts that skirt the line between superstition and ritual. Even handwriting analysis suggests that certain documents may have been altered or deliberately misrecorded, raising the possibility that the Whitmores themselves concealed critical truths. Folklorists in particular emphasize the evolution of thestery into legend. Over decades, the Whitmore tragedy became moral instruction disguised as narrative, a cautionary tale about family ambition, the perils of pride, and the consequences of ignoring moral obligations. Oral histories recount whispered warnings to children not to enter the manor. Local preachers used the story as a metaphor for divine judgment, and neighbors spoke of strange lights in the windows, or of shadows that moved, independently of human presence. Psychological and cultural theorists argue that these recurring motifs reveal a community processing trauma through narrative, embedding fear and moral reflection into the collective memory. In this sense, the Whitmore banquet was less a historical event and more a living, breathing cautionary myth that transcended its original moment. Scientific investigation attempted to pierce the veil of superstition. Contemporary chemists revisited traces of residue collected from surviving plates and glassware. Certain compounds suggested the presence of toxic botanicals, some common in medicinal practices of the era, others rare and potentially lethal in small doses. Yet even this evidence failed to explain why symptoms appeared simultaneously across multiple guests, some of whom had consumed different dishes. Epidemiologists suggested a form of foodborne illness, but no pathogen could be conclusively identified. Psychologists proposed mass psychosomatic response, intensified by the atmosphere of expectation, tension, and latent guilt among the family and guests. Each hypothesis, while plausible, left gaps that could not be reconciled, further fueling speculation and the cultural weight of legend. The role of human intention is equally contested. Some historians point to long-standing rivalries within the Whitmore household, inheritance disputes, social snubs, and personal vendettas that may have motivated deliberate harm. Others posit a more symbolic interpretation, that certain rituals performed during meal preparation reflected beliefs in ancestral justice or karmic balance, rather than premeditated violence. Diaries, personal letters, and estate inventories hint at meticulous preparation of the banquet, from ingredient selection to seating arrangements. But the motivations behind such attention to detail remain obscure. Was it meticulous hospitality gone tragically awry, or a calculated orchestration designed to punish or test members of the family? Cultural and psychological legacies deepen the mystery. Generations of descendants recall dreams and sensations tied to the night of the banquet. The lingering scent of rare spices, imagined whispers in the halls, and fleeting images of ghostly figures. Survivors' testimonies describe subtle, persistent effects on personality, health, and family dynamics, suggesting that trauma did not conclude with the deaths, but propagated through memory and behavior. Anthropologists argue that this intergenerational transmission of fear and guilt mirrors phenomena observed in communities facing collective catastrophe. The original event serves as a seed for social conditioning, moral instruction, and psychological imprinting, ensuring that even those not present inherit the weight of the incident. Legally, the banquet remains a paradox. No formal charges were ever filed. No investigations concluded definitively. Coroners and physicians recorded ambiguous findings, often contradicting one another, leaving the official record frustratingly incomplete. Attempts to reconcile evidence with folklore only produced more contradictions. Eyewitnesses' accounts were inconsistent, some suggesting illness, others deliberate poisoning, some describing spectral phenomena that defied rational explanation. This gap between legal documentation and lived experience mirrors the broader tension between evidence and perception, fact and belief, a tension that continues to define the Whitmore narrative. The story's endurance lies in ambiguity. Digital scans and modern analysis reveal further anomalies. Letters with missing passages, discrepancies in published accounts, and subtle alterations to estate inventories. These gaps offer fertile ground for speculation. Psychologists interpret them as manifestations of collective desire to impose narrative coherence on chaos, while folklorists view them as natural evolution of myth. Cultural critics suggest the tale resonates because it touches universal anxieties, trust within family, vulnerability in the face of unseen forces, and the fragility of social order. Each retelling reinforces the story, allowing each generation to project its fears, morals, and curiosities onto the Whitmore manor. Ethically, the narrative provokes reflection. Was the banquet a cautionary tale of moral failure, a human tragedy misinterpreted as supernatural, or a combination of both? Modern scholars grapple with the intersection of human agency and environmental context. A wealthy, isolated family, steeped in tradition, confronted with the limits of knowledge, medicine, and morality at the fin de siècle. The psychological complexity of the Whitmore family offers a lens into social hierarchies, inherited guilt, and the consequences of concealing secrets. Simultaneously, the cultural resonance of the story illustrates how communities navigate uncertainty, fear, and moral ambiguity through narrative construction. In the end, the Whitmore banquet resists closure. Was it deliberate murder, ancestral curse, psychosomatic contagion, or the tragic intersection of multiple factors? Each theory carries weight and flaw in equal measure. Digital artifacts, manuscripts, and folklore sustain a conversation that spans more than a century, challenging historians, psychologists, and the public to reconcile fact with perception. The banquet has become emblematic of a broader human phenomenon, our need to find explanation, morality, and pattern in events that may inherently defy comprehension. Its legacy endures not merely in historical records, but in the collective imagination, a reminder that some tragedies and the mysteries surrounding them cannot be fully untangled. The The tale of the Whitmore banquet exemplifies the power of ambiguity, memory, and narrative. Its lessons, both moral and psychological, extend beyond Charleston, inviting reflection on human behavior, belief, and the delicate balance between what is known and what is feared. Each retelling, each examination of evidence or folklore, perpetuates the haunting, ensuring that the banquet remains a living, unresolved mystery, a story where certainty is shattered, and the spaces between fact, perception, and myth expand rather than contract. The Whitmore legacy, therefore, is not confined to the deaths themselves, but to the ripple effect across time, ethical reflection, psychological inquiry, cultural narrative, and the persistent human fascination with the unexplained. It is in this interplay between rational investigation, folkloric imagination, and moral inquiry that the banquet finds its lasting resonance, compelling viewers to question what is real, what is remembered, and what is merely imagined, leaving the ultimate truth forever out of reach. The Whitmore banquet remains one of Charleston's most enduring enigmas, a story that refuses to settle into neat explanation. Over a century later, historians, folklorists, psychologists, and locals alike continue to revisit the events of that fateful night. Yet no consensus emerges. Was the tragedy the result of deliberate human malice, a catastrophic accident, or a convergence of forces that blurred the line between the natural and the supernatural? Each perspective illuminates part of the story while leaving vast gaps in understanding, ensuring that the mystery retains its haunting power. Surviving documents, including letters, diaries, and estate inventories, are fragmented, sometimes contradictory, and occasionally altered, suggesting concealment, manipulation, or perhaps the inevitable erosion of memory over time. These lacunae compel scholars and enthusiasts alike to navigate between fact and conjecture, establishing attention at the heart of the Whitmore narrative, the persistent clash between evidence and imagination, the rational and the inexplicable. The manor itself stands as a silent witness, a character in its own right. Its echoing halls, ornate dining rooms, and secluded kitchens bear the imprint of wealth and authority, while simultaneously amplifying fear and uncertainty. Descendants' recollections, local lore, and recurring dreams perpetuate the story, creating a cultural haunting that transcends the physical space. Shadows that seem to move independently, fleeting scents of rare herbs, and the imagined creak of floorboards all contribute to a sense that the Whitmore legacy continues to interact with the present. Psychologists suggest these phenomena reflect collective trauma, inherited anxiety, and the ways human consciousness absorbs and preserves fear. Folklorists, in contrast, highlight the symbolic function of the story, a moral caution, a reflection on the dangers of pride, secrecy, and intergenerational guilt. The banquet's unresolved nature challenges viewers to confront fundamental questions about morality, human behavior, and the limits of perception. In this story, innocence and malevolence coexist uneasily. The line between victim and perpetrator blurs. Was the family complicit in their own undoing, or were they pawns in forces beyond their understanding? Did science, with its chemical analyses and forensic reconstructions, ever truly touch the truth? Or did superstition and psychological projection dominate the narrative from the start? The unanswered questions are as vital as the known facts, for they sustain the story's power, drawing each generation into reflection, speculation, and debate. Ultimately, the Whitmore banquet shattered more than lives. It fractured certainty itself. The missing gore, altered records, the conflicting eyewitness testimonies, and the lingering sensations of fear all form a tapestry in which truth and myth intertwine. The event's endurance lies not merely in historical documentation, but in its ongoing psychological and cultural resonance. It compels us to examine the spaces between record, memory, and imagination, challenging the assumption that any human experience can be fully contained or explained. Perhaps the most chilling lesson is this: some tragedies exist not to be solved, but to persist, haunting consciousness, reminding us that the line between comprehension and uncertainty is fragile, porous, and eternally captivating. The story closes without closure. Viewers are left to wonder, to debate, and to reflect. Perhaps the Whitmore family table remains, in a sense, unbroken, still gathering the living, the dead, and the questions that will never find final answers. Its shadow stretches across time, a testament to the enduring power of mystery, memory, and the human need to confront what lies beyond explanation.